Whenever she can come on
All right, well, just before we get started, I've got a little announcement that Faisal doesn't know about. Sorry to embarrass you. As many of you may know, New Lines also has a podcast. Faisal and I both host, and we've had an impressive clutch of awards over the years. And the most recent was a Webby for Faisal's extraordinary interview with Arwa Damon. It was called The Emotional Fog of War, and if you haven't heard it, I do recommend searching the New Line site and looking for it, because it was just so powerful. It deserved that award. For some administrative reason, it got sent to my house. So I'm taking the opportunity to embarrass Faisal and say well done for the Webby that he won.
Good. Thank you. She's great. This is really great. Thank you, really.
Now, I think Lindsey probably doesn't need an introduction for anybody here, but I'm going to give it a go anyway. She is currently Channel 4 News' international editor, and over the course of the past 3 decades, she has reported from 6 continents covering major conflicts and refugee movements, including Syria, Iraq, Kosovo, Rwanda, winning many awards in the process. She is the author of Sandstorm, Libya in the Time of Revolution, and In Extremis, The Life of War Correspondent Marie Colvin, which won the 2019 James Tate Black Prize for Biography. Now, Lindsey's new book, I Brought the War With Me, it was released just yesterday. It is hot off the press. It is an astonishing work of her years reporting war, but she was careful to tell me earlier it is not a memoir. I think it's truly unlike any memoir I've ever read, but it is about her own experiences, because it recounts the decades of war in 50 vignettes of conflicts, from Uganda to Afghanistan, Iraq to Ukraine. And each short, very short chapter, it's very episodic, encapsulates a facet of war, including the emotions of hate, fear, love, compassion, and also the contradictions, the moral impossibilities that soldiers are so often forced to face. And accompanying every single vignette is a poem that captures the same feature of war. The poems are not necessarily from the same conflict as the vignette, for, as Lindsey puts it, and I quote, "Every conflict is different, but the experience of war is in some ways similar, whenever and wherever it happens." Tonight, we will be discussing the similarities between war zones and the differences between telling it straight through reporting, telling it slant through poetry. Lindsey Hilsum, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Lydia. Can I ask a question first?
Yeah.
So I've never been interviewed by 2 people before. So is it like an interrogation where there's good cop and bad cop?
Exactly, it's a good cop, bad cop thing.
Oh, okay, fine.
Yeah. It seems like what, obviously, I'm sure you've been interrogated many times at borders and places like this. So you're familiar with the way that you can undermine the interrogators. When we had Lise Doucette, who Lindsey knows very well, the way that she chose to do it was to just completely take over the audience and start asking me questions. So the whole...
Which
I'm wondering...
just happened.
Yeah, which has just happened.
I already did that, didn't I?
Yes.
I didn't check with her first.
No.
I thought of it on my own.
It's just the journalistic impulse.
It certainly is.
And I actually want to start with a question of what got left out, because I think when war poetry is mentioned, certainly in this country, given our education, is World War I poetry. And there's surprisingly little of that. There's a Siegfried Sassoon poem, but it's not one of the famous ones. I'd never read it before. And so was that a conscious decision on your part to leave it out?
So the seed of this book was I've always carried a volume of poetry with me on my travels. It's just what I do. And at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, I was in Kramatorsk in the east. And when the war started, I knew it was coming. Of course, that was why I was there. But I sort of couldn't quite believe it. I couldn't believe that this was happening in Europe right now. And so, because I always turned to poetry, that's what I did. And then I started to tweet out a poem a day. And then I found that people were responding to me, that they really, they felt the sort of solace of poetry, or they felt that poetry expressed something that they couldn't otherwise find a way of expressing. And so, to begin with, I did turn a lot to the World War I poets, and then I kind of ran out. And so I started to look, and then I began to realize, oh my God, there's so much more to poetry, to war poetry than that, which I kind of already knew, but then I found it more and more. And so that led to a Poetry Please on Radio 4 with Roger McGough, and then I thought, well, maybe I can turn this into a book. And one of my aims in the book was, because we are so dominated in our understanding of what war poetry is by those soldier poets of World War I, whether it's Wilfred Owen or Rupert Brooke or Siegfried Sassoon, as you mentioned, that kind of distorts, because a lot of war poets are women, some war poets are children. And there is so much poetry coming out of Ukraine, coming out of Gaza, coming out of Syria, coming out of all of these war zones, and Sri Lanka and all sorts of places. And so I wanted to get into all of that. And then I started to look back as well. So do you know who the first war poet was? Anybody know? You do, because you read the book, you can't say. Anybody here know who the first war poet was?
What I was going to say is I don't know how to pronounce it.
Ah, very good. Okay.
So I don't want to say.
Okay.
Any ideas?
Enheduanna. Enheduanna was a Sumerian priestess in in what is now Iraq, in 2300 BCE. And she is the first war poet, some people say the first author, to have her own name, or a name attached to writing. Others at that time, you know, it was just sort of oral history. It was passed down. And there's a new translation of her poetry. She's a bit into the old rivers of blood, is Enheduanna. I found it slightly difficult. And she is in here. I did sort of struggle a bit, because she doesn't have a sort of modern sensibility on the issue of slaughter. She's rather in favour of slaughter, is Enheduanna. But I just thought it was so fascinating, given what we think war poetry is, that the first war poet is not only from so long ago, but also a woman.
Well, I did want to choose a poem to open with, to give people a flavour, and it was impossible to choose because of the impressively wide amount of reading that was drawn on. And so much is in translation. It's by so many people I'd never heard of. There was also the very real consideration that I might not be able to get through some of these. They're really powerful writing. Yeah. And a particular shout out, we mentioned this just earlier, to Kevin Powers, an American vet who served in Iraq, and I'd never heard of him. The emotions pack such a punch that I actually found when I was preparing I couldn't get to the end out loud. So to pick up on something in the intro, which is how similar wars are, the most obvious example of that is civil wars, when all over the world families, friends are forced to choose a side and often end up fighting each other. And for this, you reported on Ukraine-Russia for that facet of civil war, when people end up fighting people that they feel like are their brothers. But what you chose was a poem from Vietnam.
You know, that's exactly the poem that I chose when I was coming here tonight, and I was thinking, which one am I going to read? And I thought, oof, the Belbeck story and Pham Ho.
Do you want to take over?
Of course, I'm like least dissessed.
Isn't it a little bit late to be asking that question? I mean,
Great, I've got it written out here. I
have it here.
I think we'd love to hear you read it.
Please.
Yeah,
no. So this story is from, I'm sounding like a teacher, aren't I? Do you know what the first shot to be fired in the Ukraine-Russia war was? Anyway, you probably don't. It was March the 4th, 2014, and I was there, and it was at an air base in Crimea called Belbeck. And basically the Russians came into this Ukrainian Air Force base and tried to take over, and there was an unbelievably brave and impressive Ukrainian commander there called Yuri Mamchur, who would not surrender. And he led his soldiers up the hill to where the Russians were, and I can see it still, and set up to the Russian lines where and all the Russians were pointing their guns, and he said, "We're not going to surrender." And part of the reason he felt confident to do that is because they were brothers. because this particular Air Force base and this particular regiment had fought in World War II. They had fought the Germans, Ukrainians, Russians, Soviets, all together. So the very idea that brothers could now be fighting each other was completely beyond Yuri Mamchur. And so I was looking for a poem about a place where brother had fought brother, and of how painful that was. And it's in a section of the book about love, because it's about somebody you loved who you then hate. And this is a poem called Beautiful and Loving Days Gone by Pam Ho, written in 1950 during the time of the Indochina War, when the French were fighting the Vietnamese. I shot him. The beautiful and loving days gone by could not stop me. His body lay on the dike, no longer the boy I had known. I looked at his face, grieved for the boy I had lost. Of course, as I read that now, I don't really know which one of those two boys was on which side. And I don't know if his friend, before he was killed, wrote a poem. Felt the same.
What is it that you find helps you in the middle of these war zones with reading poetry?
Well, that says something that I can't say as a journalist, doesn't it? So it's a number of things. I mean, I feel that poetry takes off where the limits of journalism. So if you're a journalist, you know, who, what, when, where, and why. We have to tell the facts, and we have, as best we can, and we have to try and puncture the lies that politicians tell us, and we have to, find our way to to the truth. And we do, particularly in television. I think that we can convey the emotion of the people we are reporting amongst. I report. I would say generally I report much more amongst civilians than I do amongst soldiers, although I've done both. But you get to a point in the language, it's not enough, and the elusive power of poetry is so much more powerful. But then there's also a thing, because I certainly turn to poetry when I'm trying to make sense of things.
Yeah.
I spent a lot of my life in places where it's chaos. War is a certain kind of chaos. And the poetry imposes some kind of verbal order on things, but it's also, and this is something I got from Henry Siegert, who edits several volumes of poetry called the Poetry Pharmacy, which are like your personal problems and poems which may, resonate with you from that, which I would recommend. And he says that poetry gives you a connection because someone else has felt something similar to what you're feeling, but it also gives you a distance because the words, somebody else's words, also mean that you can, I suppose it's impose an order on it. So it's both of those two things. And of course we know, when people are bereaved, they often turn to poetry, don't they? Or they're divorced or whatever. So this is really, I suppose, just an extension of that.
But I wondered if maybe you reading them in the midst of war zones might also be an attempt to think about what you might think of it like this too shall pass.
Yeah.
That you're trying to think about something that comes after the war, and you think, well, these poems were written about wars long ago, and the world moved on, the world survived, and perhaps that is also...
No, I think that's a very good point. I hadn't thought about it like that, but I think you're absolutely right. And particularly if you're reading the old poetry, you do get a sense of, of that passing of time. One of my favourite poems in the book, which you mentioned, this was the Siegfried Sassoon poem. So Siegfried Sassoon in 1939 wrote a poem about his son. So his son George is in the window of the house, and Siegfried Sassoon comes back from a ride with his whip. He was very posh, we're sorry about that. And anyway, he comes back and he looks up at the child in the window, all heaven for him. And he says, but you must know beyond bewildering years that little things beloved and held are best. The windows of the world are blurred with tears, and troubles come like cloud bursts from the west. Remember this some afternoon in spring, when your own child looks down and makes your sad heart sing. I can't read that one without crying, by the way.
That was a lot of my preparation was
Yeah,
like that.
you said that.
Sorry, I'm just looking up one other which is very, very short, and the reason I'm looking this one up is because it's very funny. So one of the sections, this is one of my absolute favourite poems. One of the sections is on warlords, and I did a thing about Saddam Hussein, and this is a poem called Image by Maung San Ka, who is he now actually leads the Bayman People's Liberation Army in Myanmar. He got imprisoned for this poem, which is, I have the president's portrait tattooed on my penis. How disgusted my wife is. So I just wanted to put that one in because poetry can also be a bit naughty, where
And can mock.
and can mock
put
and
people in
can
their
do other
place.
things. I can't do that one. Well, obviously for various reasons, I can't really do that one in journalism either.
On Channel 4.
I have to say, the other thing was, if you do a book of poetry, anybody who's thinking of doing an anthology of poetry, don't. Because getting the permissions is an incredibly complicated thing, and we actually employed somebody, Chatto employed somebody to do that, and it's very complicated. And that one, I said, there's no way, I mean, you're going to get permission for that, but I'm sure he wouldn't mind. He's the leader of the Bayman People's Liberation Army. Anyway, she's a very dutiful person, and she found an email for the Bayman People's Liberation Army. And they came back and said, the permission for what you have asked is fine by us. We cannot find Maung San Ka now, but please feel free.
Okay, wow.
So we did.
There you go.
And now there's another universal of war that I found very striking.
What was the email heading on that? Was it
I didn't actually see the email.
Your
I've got to say-
commander's penis? What was
Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, how do you craft it? But something that struck me in the intro about one of the universalities of war was how alluring it is to a certain subsection
Oh,
of
yes.
people, including foreign correspondents
Oh, yes.
and others. And I'm going to quote, "War gives your life purpose and meaning. Suddenly you believe you know what matters and what can be dismissed as unimportant." And here's the crucial bit. "The colours are brighter and the mountains clearer. You live in the moment. There's a wonderful camaraderie with others going through the same experience, and surviving a near miss gives you a heady rush of adrenaline." So this sense of meaning, of being more alive than normal, it lends itself to poetry, doesn't it?
Yeah, it lends itself to poetry, and it lends itself to journalism and to the kind of people that journalists are. And I think that you have to, as a journalist, I think you have to interrogate yourself on that. And the love thing is really interesting because I have a love for my colleagues. In television, you work in a group. Often as you're a print journalist or a snapper, you may be working alone. But I'm always working with a team, with a camera operator, with a producer, with a local producer. And the kind of love that I feel for them is like no other. I mean, it's very, very intense. And that is similar to the love that soldiers have for each other, because we all know that soldiers, in the end, they fight for the platoon, for the unit, for each other, more than for the cause. That's what nearly all soldiers say when you interview them. So it's that group thing. And yes, obviously, a war is an extreme situation, and that is also obviously why why it lends itself to poetry, and why there's a growing body of refugee poetry, some of which is remarkable. But I think that from a journalist's point of view, this is a trap, and you have to be very careful, because you can come back and think that you're terribly important and what you've done is terribly important, and you know what? Not necessarily.
Well, this is the distinction that you draw in the book between
Yeah.
those people who go to war zones, the aid workers, the journalists,
Yeah,
and
people
so on.
have chosen.
Yeah, and then those people who've had the wars visited upon them, who
Yeah.
are, of course, the bigger number. When you think about your desire to go to these war zones, do you think that sometimes, along with the camaraderie is a big part of it? I mean, your colleagues are going, you've been to other war zones with them, you feel like you want to go along with it. But do you think there's also something that's kind of alluring about being in that atmosphere?
Yeah, there is. Look, it's an extreme situation, and some people are drawn to extreme situations. And I think that also for me, and I think for most journalists, there's a sense of wanting to be where history is happening. I don't particularly want to be where history isn't happening, and I still have that. When the Hezbollah pages all went off the day before yesterday, I was like, Frontline Club, I said, oh, fuck, I'm promoting a book, I can't go. You know, and so that's, you know, that's how we are. But I suppose I would stress that I think that one of the things I have learned over the years is that there's a kind of self-aggrandizement in that you have to be very careful of. That, you know, it doesn't make you a better person or a more interesting person or a more important person. It just means that you're the person who wants to do that. And other people want to do other things which are just as important and less suspect in some ways.
But it's hard, isn't it? I mean, I think we'll come to the personal questions a bit later, but it is quite...
Oh, we will? I think we might have run out of time before then.
Well, we'll move it up if you want. But I thought it was interesting reading the book that you go to these places and then you come back, you land at Heathrow, you get on the underground, and it must be, you have to go and see your editor, to talk to Kristen Grew Murphy. You know,
Oh, no, I never do that.
No, it's better, yeah. And it must be very boring.
No, absolutely not. No, so I have a very small but very beautiful North London garden.
Okay.
Right. And so it is very important to me to come back and to sort out my garden. And I think about that. And I think domestic things are very important. In 2014 in Donetsk, the loft company which was doing the loft extension went bust while I was in Donetsk. And I can remember lying in my bed in a hotel in Donetsk under Russian fire crying about my loft extension. And and although I thought, oh, for God's sake, Lindsay, you know, the other part of me thinks, actually, that's quite good. You know, I really do. And I have to tell you, the company went bust, but we got somebody to finish it off, and it's great. The loft extension is really good. And the garden...
At least one part of that story has an ending.
Oh, yeah, that's a happy ending. The other bit, not so good. But the garden, for me, I mean, you can use a sort of fancy word like therapy. But the garden, in which I grow nothing sensible like vegetables, it's all flowers, it's all colour, you know, I think it could be entered for a new category at Chelsea, which is largest amount of money spent on smallest space. But, you know, it means a lot to me. And also I can see my friends, so I just bang on a bit about this a bit because when I come, I actually love coming home. You know, there's that Simon & Garfunkel song, you know, gee, but it's great to be back home. Home is where I want to be. I've been on the road so long, my friend. I can't remember the next line. And, you know, and I see my friends, we go to the movies, go out for dinner, you know, it's all really important.
Real life is good too.
Yeah.
Well, thinking about those intense relationships formed in theatres of war, and I think we've touched on this in so many events. Clarissa Ward spoke of it, Lisa spoke of it.
Lisa and Clarissa would definitely.
They both talked about how these friendships are they're different to other types of friendship, formed in this way. So of course that brings us on to your dear friend and colleague Marie Colvin,
Of course.
Who was killed in Syria in 2012, likely targeted by Assad and his forces. Now, you wrote her biography, In Extremis, and won an award for it, and it's extremely different, obviously, to this one. How did you approach writing that book as a fellow journalist, as a friend, as a biographer? What was your thought process?
Well, so when Marie was killed, obviously I was extremely distressed, and I had spoken to her just about 8 hours earlier, and I had said she was in a place called Baba Ammar in Homs in Syria, and I was home by then. We'd met in Lebanon and had dinner in Beirut about, I don't know, maybe 10 days earlier, and then I was back in London because I'd said, no, it's too dangerous, beyond my dangerous threshold, I'm not going in. Because to go into rebel-held Syria at that time was unbelievably dangerous. Anyway, but she did it. That was Marie. And I had spoken to her by satellite phone, and I said, and I was kind of pissed off with her for being there. And I said, what's your exit strategy? And she said, that's just it, Lindsay, I haven't got one. And I'm like, fuck's sake. So, you know, I was pretty upset by them. And then she was killed. And so, and then from my own personal point of view, I decided I couldn't go back into war zones for a little while after that. For about 6 to 9 months, I was like, I can't do this. And then so it was all about Marie, and obviously there was the whole thing of repatriating the body, and then her colleague, Paul Conroy, who's a very close friend of mine, was a photographer working with her, trying to get him out because he was injured and stuck in Bab Ammar, and his book and the film Under the Wire is just unbelievable, and I would highly recommend it to you. Then I was thinking, what do I do? What do I do with all this? And I knew that she had written a lot of diaries and journals, which were in the keeping of her best friend, Jane Wellesley. And I knew somebody would write a biography of Marie, and then you're all going to think that I'm a mad woman at this point, okay? She came to me in a dream, where she basically said, do it, and then I will let you go, because I felt that she had me. And she said, I will let you go. And so I did it. And so and also I had the trust, I was lucky, because I had the trust of her ex-partners. I lost that in the writing of the book, but never mind. They didn't like what I said, but then they shouldn't have been so horrible to her, should they? But I had the trust of her family and of Jane Wellesley and the people who owned the rights and all the rest of it. So I had the opportunity to read all her diaries and so on. And it's a very strange thing to get to know your friend better in death than in life. But I had the most, from a sort of, if you stand back from a biographer's point of view, it's extraordinary. I had all this first-hand material that nobody had ever seen before. And very few biographers have that. And then I interviewed about 100 people. And because we're all journalists, so we love to talk. You can't shut us up. And so, it was very easy to talk to people. Everybody wanted to talk about Marie.
Yeah. And did she approve? Did she come back to you in another dream and say...
Yeah, she came to me after... yeah, she did.
She did?
She was cool. She was cool.
Before we talk more about Marie, actually, maybe it's a moment to interject. Do you think that, it sounds like you might be a little bit superstitious? Is that fair?
Me?
No, I'm wondering, because apart from the Marie dream,
Yes.
but do you think when you go to these places, there's so much random chance in wars.
Oh, there so is.
Just the chance of being, we've all seen footage of people they're standing somewhere and then a bomb drops or a sniper or something completely, and the person right next to them is completely unharmed. Do you have an element of that in your thinking, that you have a lucky charm or something?
Yeah, look, the lucky charms. Oh, dear. Yeah. So, with me I carry the bullet that came through the window of the hotel in Tripoli that hit the ceiling and came down and didn't hurt any of us. I travel with that. What else do I have? I have the flattened bullet of the stories in there of the colonel who had been imprisoned in Iraq, and we came across him after Saddam Hussein had fallen, and we were in prison, in the grounds of a prison, and there was a massive mural of Saddam Hussein, and he said, "Come with me, film this." And so we did. And he got out his pistol and he shot Saddam Hussein, the picture, and he said, "I was forced to paint that mural, and now I've shot him." I have that bullet. He shot him several times. I have one of the bullets. So yes, I do carry a few things like that with me, but I'm not in the slightest bit superstitious.
I was interviewing the Wall Street Journal journalist Yaroslav Trofimov.
Oh, Yarrow, yes.
Just earlier this week. He has a new book as well, which will be on a
He
podcast.
has 2 books. That's what's so annoying about Yarrow.
Yeah, he has 2 books.
He has 2 bloody books. How can you do that? He has a book about the war in Ukraine, and he has a novel which is based on his grandmother's life, because he is Ukrainian origin. We all hate Yarrow because we have no understanding of how he managed to write 2 books at the same time.
Some war reporting does make an immediate difference.
Yeah,
and some, like the Syrian civil war, might take a while. He said that the Ukrainian war the reporting made a significant difference to the public interest at the beginning of the war and then subsequently to the political interest. Does that also track
I think
with
that's true. It hasn't stopped Putin, has it?
No, it hasn't stopped the war happening at all. It hasn't reached a settlement, but I think his feeling was that it meant that people took an interest in it in the way that he thought at the beginning they would dismiss it in the way they dismissed the 2014 Crimea invasion.
Yeah, but I think I think he has a point, but one of my concerns is that the war in Ukraine has got a lot of attention, which I think is absolutely right, but it's pushed out other things, and sometimes I wonder if there's a racism element to that.
All right, well, should we go to the audience and hear a bit from the audience, and then we might come back on stage. Ina's already, I've got my hand up. Can we get Tam, do you have the microphone or someone?
There's a spare one up here, look.
So we'll take a couple of questions. There are some of you who knew. How many of you are in a cult, actually, out of... Yeah, no, go on.
Hi, Lindsay.
Hi.
I just wanted to ask, I think it's really interesting how you said that poetry rises up where, it departs from journalism. And I wondered if you do see some similarities between us journalists and poets because of the kind of the kernel of truth that we're supposed to convey through our work. So that's the first question I wanted to ask. And the second more important one was, do you get any trouble going through airports when you carry those bullets?
All right, okay, very good question.
Let's take another one. Then
Do you want to take another?
Yeah,
Okay.
just before we...
There was somebody, was it?
Who was, yeah.
Oh,
Somebody here? Lady here?
yeah.
Oh, here, right.
This lady
yeah,
here?
right.
Hello. So when I talked to my family about having an interest in war journalism, they veto it immediately. So how do you make a distinction between personal life and professional life, and how did you even start with war journalism? Because you can't really have a work experience and be like, oh, I kind of like this, you know?
Very good point.
So how did you start, and how do you have a personal life, basically?
Okay.
Well, let's take those two and then
Should
we'll
we
come
take
back.
those
Yeah,
two?
yeah.
So I think it's really interesting what you say. So I feel, and I sort of don't want to sound pretentious here, but so in writing a TV script, you're condensing language right down. And so I think the fact that I read a lot of poetry and listen to a lot of songs, because I think songs are great, helps me do that, because you're boiling it right down. Another thing on songs, there was an Irish musician called Frank Hart who said, "Those in power write the history, those who suffer write the songs." I love that. And so I feel that all of that is part of journalism too. And I can't, what the second question?
Do you get stopped going through? Yeah.
Oh, bullets. Oh, right. No, it's fine. I had a problem. Yeah, actually, they're very small and they don't seem to have any gunpowder on them still, so it seems to be all right. I've never had a problem yet. Yeah, and you were
well,
asking
yeah.
about getting into it in the family. Look, families are complicated, and I've been very lucky because my family, such as it is, which is quite small, is very, very supportive. And in the end, you have to make your own decisions. But yes, you will miss, and I'm not talking about war corresponding, I'm talking about foreign corresponding. You will miss every wedding, you will miss every christening or whatever, ritual you have in your religion or whatever, for births and marriages and deaths and so on. You will miss all of your friends' birthdays, and you will be the most unreliable person in their life. And that's how it is. Now, some people see that as an advantage. Phew, don't have to go to that cousin's wedding. But then you do also miss things, and you look back and you think, oh, I missed my best friend's wedding. Best friend at the time, I tried to get back. I was in Rwanda, and I did all I could, but I was 24 hours late. She'd gone on honeymoon by then, so that is a fact of life. I don't consider myself a war correspondent, and I'm sure that neither Clarissa nor Lise would either. I'm a foreign correspondent.
Okay, let's keep going. Who else?
Oh, hi, Lindsay. Congrats on the book. It's only one at a time.
Darling.
This week, Tedros was in Sudan.
He was.
Said it's the biggest humanitarian disaster in the world, and then pointed fingers at all of us, particularly journalists, for not giving it enough prominence. He also mentioned race may be a factor. What can we do to get Sudan more on the map?
Look, I've been to Chad and I've been to Sudan. Right, I went to Sudan and reported there about, I can't remember how long ago it was. It was about 2 months ago. So I totally agree with you, and I'm very dedicated to trying to get Sudan on the map far more. And on Channel 4 News, we make sure that we do report it, but it's difficult because there's not many pictures. It's hard to get pictures, and television is about pictures. So when I went, I'll tell you another thing. Now, how annoying is this? So we went to Sudan. We went to Port Sudan, and the producer I worked with worked so hard on getting all this. We went to Omdurman. We found all sorts of stuff that other people didn't have. We had a fantastic story, and we were going to lead the program on that day. And we had an interview with Tom Perriello, who's the US envoy. We had everything to do. And that morning, a small man exited from 10 Downing Street in the pouring rain But look, Patrick, just to finish, Patrick, I don't have a good answer. I'm doing my best, and other people are too. And actually, one of the good things is since we went to Sudan, quite a lot of other people have been, and I get calls every week like, how do you do it? And I tell them how they do it. Yeah. But the part of the problem is racism, completely right. The other problem is that the two bastards problem. It's like the Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger said about the Iran-Iraq war, it's a pity that both sides can't lose. And that's exactly the situation in Sudan. You want both sides to lose. And the other thing I would say is that The Guardian have an amazing correspondent called Zainab Mohammed Saleh, whose praises I will sing forever, who's one of the bravest correspondents out. And she has done extraordinary reporting throughout across Sudan. But it's very, very difficult and very, very dangerous. And that is, and most of the Sudanese journalists have fled because it's too dangerous and they will be killed. And so it's an objective problem.
Before I have a follow-up question about Sudan. I will point out that our colleague Henry, who's filming tonight, has just come back from Sudan.
Oh,
He was in
brilliant.
Sudan.
Oh, well done, Henry.
So if the audience needs footage, that is something to discuss.
Oh, excellent.
Ironic, both people on either side of the camera are actually both
Yeah,
in
good,
Sudan.
but we'll talk about that.
But about Sudan, I mean, do
Yeah.
you think that part of the reason it's difficult, I accept the premise about the racism, but do you think one of the problems also is that there isn't a narrative that it can fit easily into?
Yeah,
There's
and
a
I think that
heroic Ukraine narrative. But
Yes,
when it comes
absolutely. But I think that the narrative which it should fit into is why is the United Arab Emirates, which is one of Britain's closest allies, arming these bastards of the Rapid Support Forces? And they deny it, the UAE denies it, but the evidence is there. And the UAE gets a pass on a lot of things because they are useful to Britain, to the EU countries and to America because they're part of negotiations over other things and so on. But they have a finger in so many pies, and this is the finger that they have, which I think is, to my knowledge, one of the most damaging. And there should be far more pressure on the UAE. And that, in a sense, I think is what says she who hasn't been doing enough on this, but we should be doing more on it, and I should be doing more on it.
Okay, very good. And this colleague here?
Hi, Lindsay.
Anybody here from the UAE? Anybody here from the UAE embassy? No, sorry, go on.
Anybody here have their phones bugged by Pegasus?
Yes, oh God, exactly.
Quite a lot of us, I imagine.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Yeah, the lady at the back, I think two women at the back.
Oh, she's being filmed. That's usually the sign of an activist group if she's being filmed. Asking the question.
You have camera people. I have a camera person too. But I wanted to know more about your creative process because you said that you listen to songs while you're creating. So I wanted to know what you were listening to when you created this book. Like, do you have a playlist?
Oh.
Okay.
Nice
listening
question.
to?
Nice
Thank
question.
you.
Nice question. I was
keep going.
expecting, the moment I saw the camera, I was expecting you to be from some little-known, guerrilla group in some country I'd never been to, and you were going to ask me why I hadn't been there.
I thought they were from MEK.
Look, different things. On the way here, I listened to some very, very loud Bruce Springsteen. I listened to the beginning of Born to Run, because I think that for a live event, it's good to kind of get yourself going. I listen to a lot of country and Western music, because country music, they tell stories. Country music tells the best stories, in my view. It's all, broken women and faithless man, and I love all that stuff. And it's all that sort of storytelling side of it. And then, I don't have a playlist as such, but, you look at protest songs, Hurricane by Dylan. Is that the best song about injustice that there's ever been? It really is. So, I'm not sure that I have anything as grandiose as a creative process, but I certainly do listen to lots of songs, and songs are going through my head the whole time, and quite often when I'm writing a TV script I kind of slip in a few lyrics from songs or poetry just to see if anybody notices. Sometimes. I sometimes get tweets from people saying, oh, I see what you did there.
For the lady who asked the question, is that because obviously when you put it on Instagram, you'll put a background to the song. Do you want to check if Instagram has those for free? Or she can name other songs, if that helps you figure it out. Because we're all about helping with other content creators. So should we keep going? Other questions? The lady here? And I think,
We've got
wasn't there somebody else at the back?
Yeah, but this gentleman's
Oh,
got
there's
the
a person,
microphone.
yeah. All right.
I just wondered,
right.
what do you think is the role of a foreign correspondent in the world of, and value of a foreign correspondent in social media and user-generated content? Is there a place for foreign correspondents?
That's good. And let's just keep going. A couple of the lady here.
Yep.
Oh, okay, all right. And then, no,
And
ask the
then
question.
there's somebody being ignored behind there. But no, you go first.
All right, we'll
and
come
then
back.
we'll
Ask
come
your
to
question, we'll ask
the
this lady,
ignored
and then we'll
lady.
come back to the person in the back.
You mentioned that you take your books of poetry with you to the different places, and I wondered which poems do you take, or do you take different ones to different places? And I definitely take my Dylan Thomas with me.
Oh, do you?
Amazing. And
I love Dylan
we'll come
Thomas.
to the person at the back.
Fern Hill has got to be one of the sort of greatest atmospheric poems on earth, hasn't it? Am I taking those two? Or
One more, I think, just... Yeah, please.
I was also wondering about the structure of the poems in the book and whether in your research anyone you came across you wanted to commission to write a poem, or they've all been previously written and previously published, and to that end as well, do you write poetry?
Very nice.
So I'm going to answer that one first. So on the do I write poetry thing, my answer is I'm a reporter. The fact that I like listening to Bruce Springsteen does not mean that I think I am Bruce Springsteen. I do not think that I am Bruce Springsteen, and I do not write poetry. What was the other part? So we're going backwards.
So then the lady's question about which poems do you take with you and
Oh,
where?
well, so I take a sort of random section. I take a lot of James Fenton. So James Fenton, as some of you may know, was a foreign correspondent. He was in Cambodia, in Vietnam. He's also a friend of mine, and he kind of did this thing. He kind of moved on from writing prose and journalism into being a poet, and I believe that he's one of the greatest poets of our age. I think he's amazing. So my kind of default, running out of the door is, selected poems of James Fenton. But then I quite often take some anthologies of different ones. I used to buy lots of anthologies in second-hand shops. And now, of course, most places have internet, and so I'm Googling quite a lot. So it's the same as with songs and things. You try and expand your range because most of us get sort of stuck in a range. And one of the great things about doing this book is it's expanded my range. And so I've read a lot more. There was a point where I did think that I was reading 100 shit poems for every good poem that I could put in the book. But I have come across some extraordinary new poets who I hadn't come across before. So probably the next time, I've just received a copy of Forest of Noise, which is the new book by Mossab Abu Toha, who is a fantastic Gazan poet who writes in English. And probably the next place I go, I will take that with me.
I mean, I guess we'll come to the multimedia question, the
social media question was a good question. Yeah.
But I guess to some degree you need to go and see it. I mean, Ukraine is a good example. You probably would have gone into that war thinking, if I have to take a collection of poetry, no one could have guessed that war would have ended up being trench warfare,
no, exactly.
Second World War style war. So you would have taken a different type of poem, and then you go there and you see the reality and you think, what best fits.
That's right. But then, as I say, you can look it up. So let me take your question about social media. I think it's really enhanced our reporting. So as somebody who's an eyewitness journalist, I believe in being there. I'm aware of the limitations on that. I believe in it. But in Syria, for example, all of these local journalists and activists were taking footage, what we call UGC, user-generated content. And at Channel 4 News, we then started to employ an incredibly talented Palestinian Lebanese journalist called Kamal Kadura, who has developed this as an expertise. And so starting with Syria, he would be trawling through all of this stuff, and he knows things that I don't about how you verify things, because you can verify it. I don't know, you look at stamps and you look at all sorts of things, and then he got to know who was uploading a lot of this stuff and so on. And so his input into the journalism that we do at Channel 4 News has been absolutely invaluable. And I think that most newsrooms now employ these kind of people who were doing incredible work, including investigative work. And so I think that the best kind of journalism is often a collaboration between eyewitness journalists and what you would call, open source intelligence journalists. I think that when we work together, that's when we get the best stuff.
Should I take a couple more questions?
There's a lady here who's
Yeah,
been
I'm the
waiting.
ignored lady, but
She's the ignored lady.
I'm now in possession of a
sorry.
microphone, so
Okay, good.
I actually wanted to ask about your other book about In Extremis, which well, it was brilliant. I read it when I
This is
I
about
moved
Marie
to,
Colvin.
about
Yeah.
Marie Colvin.
Yeah.
And I remember reading it. I just moved to Kinshasa and I was quite lonely.
Oh,
and
wow.
And
Oh,
I,
my
and I
God,
was reading
that
it. It was
cheered you
brilliant.
up then.
I actually did. I found it fascinating. It was great. But one thing I loved about it was that it was about her life, but it was also interspersed with these very personal details from her diaries.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you had any reservations about publishing some of the bits in her diaries, 'cause I guess you couldn't have asked her permission. And I remember reading that as I was thinking that as I was reading through it, and if it was a difficult decision about what to include and what to leave out.
Yeah.
Take another
No,
one.
it was a very look. It's a very good question because it was a dilemma all the way through. I mean, one thing I would say is that Marie, in her will, she left her diaries and her journals to her then boyfriend for the purposes of a biography. So she knew there would be a biography about her, and so she knew that that stuff was going to go in there. Marie was not the world's most private person. Anybody who'd been to a dinner party with her after she'd had several glasses of wine might have known more about things than they necessarily needed to know. So I was aware of all of that. But at the same time, you are dealing with the reputation of somebody. It was this really complicated thing because I wanted to be honest about Marie. Marie drank too much. Marie took a lot of lovers. Marie was this, she lived in extremis. That was who she was. And I hoped that in doing it, that I could, show all of that. But I loved her. And I hope that the book was written with love. And I was also worried about protecting the living. And so I certainly didn't put everything in that I know or that I found out. And I did hold quite a lot back, which I felt would be very damaging and would upset a lot of people who were still around. So it is a complicated balance, and I'm sure I didn't get the balance 100% right, but I was certainly aware of that dilemma all the time that I was writing.
The gentleman there in the blue.
Hi, Lindsay.
Oh, hello.
I was wondering what your coping mechanism was for witnessing trauma. Like we see you, but you see all that, and when you're away a lot, like the sadness, anger, like how do you get to sleep? You must take it with you everywhere.
Yeah, well, the book is called I Brought the War With Me, which is a line from a poem by Warsan Shire, who was a fantastic Kenyan Somali poet. I think that there's a number of things. I mean, one is I think you do need breaks, and I think that it's important to do other stories as well, so not just do war. And I haven't always, in recent years, I've been less successful about that than in other years. And so I say, in that time, I went to when I went to China in 2006, I'd had it up to here, particularly with the Middle East and with conflict and so on, and I just needed a break. So I think that knowing yourself is quite important. I think to know when you've had enough and you can't take any more. I think that, and again, that comes with age. You begin to know the sort of warning signs when you're going a bit off, a bit wild-eyed. And the garden, which I've talked about, is important. Going to the west of Ireland to stay with my friend Rosemary, who's over there. That's pretty important. Her dog, he's important. The waves on the shore near Westport, that's all important, isn't it? She's not a bad form of therapy. My friend Lucy, wherever she is, over there, going to the movies with her, all of this kind of stuff. That is how I regulate it, by having other things in life. And I think that that is how anybody, whether you're an aid worker or a journalist or a soldier, or any of the people who you were talking about earlier, who choose to go to war, you have to do that. And one of the, if I can just say, one of the really difficult things about Ukraine at the moment is that the soldiers are not getting a break. The soldiers in Ukraine, many of them have had no break for 2 years, and they are absolutely up to here, and that is a real problem.
I think we'll end it there. I think that's probably enough for now. Yeah.
Go on, let the lady have one more question.
I'm annoying everyone.
Yeah.
Well, hi, Lindsay. I was actually going to talk about An Extremist as well.
Fine.
I read it a few months ago. It was amazing. So I was just wondering, because I'm writing a book now myself, sometimes it's very hard to get into the writing mode with things, especially when you're doing a day job, and then you just nobody has the luxury of sitting and just writing for days anymore. So I was wondering, with you, since you do so many different things, how do you help yourself get into the writing mode?
The writing mode, yeah. No, it's a very good question. So I'm lucky because I work for a good employer, and what I was just talking about, getting some breaks and so on, I get that. But I think that all of us who write, you get up in the morning and it's kind of hard to write. So I have a very simple solution: online shopping. So I get up, I go swimming. This is my routine. I get up, I go swimming, I have a cup of black coffee, and then I do online shopping, right, for a bit. And quite often it involves the purchase of things that I then send back, right? But I'm kind of I can't write. Anyway, so a little bit of that sort of gets me into the mood, and then I sort of gradually settle down to it. But I'm certainly not one of those people. Oh my God, there are people who get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and write for 3 hours and then go to work. I am not that person. I have to carve out time when I can write. Can I tell one brief online shopping story?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is my
Can you name the retailer though, please?
No. When I was writing the Marie book, I was doing this thing, and I woke up one morning and I thought, leather jacket. I need a leather jacket. I've never had a leather jacket. Anyway, but I needed a leather jacket in that moment, so I'm on, and I find a leather jacket. So I buy the leather jacket. And it comes a few days later, and I try it on, and I look in the mirror, and I go, okay. It was Marie's leather jacket. It was a leather jacket very similar to one that Marie wore. And I realized that actually it was part of the process, because I was putting on her clothes. And I didn't know it when I was doing it. So I think that with writing, all sorts of things are going on in your subconscious. And so when you can't quite get down to it, sometimes things are still happening, even if you're not sitting there doing the actual writing. So you have to have faith in yourself.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Lindsay.
Oh my God. And people were like, the flag lit. No, you don't want to know how hard everything is. Oh, that's why I know you. Are you coming? Mel, back to No, that's right. No.